Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going on a journey
Ooh, a journey.
through the history of the Second Amendment.
Uh-huh.
And this isn't going to be your typical, textbook thing.
No, no.
We're going deep, uncovering the global story behind the right to bear arms and why it was so important to the Founding Fathers.
It's fascinating.
Get ready for some, serious aha moments, right?
It's really interesting how this topic is always like a uniquely American issue when
Right.
its roots are actually much deeper, right? Goes
Right.
back centuries.
Our source for this deep dive is a YouTube video from TRX Arms. It's titled TRX Talk, The History of the Second Amendment, hosted by Isaac and David. They start by talking about this really striking trend. Despite all the political back and forth, gun sales have been breaking records these last few years,
Yeah.
even on people you wouldn't traditionally think of as gun owners.
Yeah.
We're talking more guns sold in 2020 than in all of 2019, which itself was a record-breaking year.
It's really interesting, isn't it?
What do you make of this, surge in gun ownership?
I think it begs the question, right? Why is it still such a hot button issue if more and more people are exercising their Second Amendment rights? We need to go back to the foundation. Why the founders even put that right there in the first place?
Right. And that takes us to this concept the video hosts bring up,
Okay.
something called the monopoly on violence. Could you unpack that a little?
Well, think of it this way. In any society, someone has to hold the power to use force. The question is who? The government or the people?
Right.
The founders decided to place this power, this monopoly on violence, in the hands of the people as a safeguard against tyranny.
That's a powerful idea. So they weren't just talking about, protecting yourself from, a burglar. They were talking about protecting liberty from a potentially overreaching government.
Exactly. And that has profound implications, right? If the people have the right to bear arms, it shifts the entire power dynamic between the citizen and the state. It challenges the state's authority.
Wow. The video hosts make a point I thought was really interesting. This whole right to bear arms thing is not some, uniquely American concept.
No.
It goes way back. It has roots in English common law.
It does. They point to examples like the Assize of Arms of 1181, which required people to own weapons that were suitable for their social class. It wasn't about preference. It was a civic duty
Wow.
tied to defending the realm. And then you have the Statute of Winchester in 1285, which reinforced these requirements.
Wait, so owning weapons was a civic duty? That's pretty far
Yeah.
from how we tend to think about it today.
Certainly is. And it gets even more interesting. English archery laws from 1363 required archery practice on Sundays and holidays.
Wow.
Mandatory archery practice on your day off. But it speaks volumes about the importance of a citizen's ability to defend their community.
Right. So this wasn't just about, individual self-preservation. It was about collective security. It was a responsibility to everybody else. So basically, the American founders weren't inventing something entirely new. When they wrote the Second Amendment, they were drawing on this long tradition of citizen militias and, a healthy distrust of standing armies controlled by a central power.
Absolutely. Remember, they lived in a time when the Prussian model was becoming popular in Europe, a powerful, centralized military. Frederick the Great's victories in the mid-1700s led many countries to copy his methods. But the founders saw the downsides of that model,
Right.
a professional army answering only to a king or a small ruling class. They saw the potential for abuse,
Right.
for tyranny.
Wow.
And that's why they were so intent on ensuring that people had the means to resist.
Right.
They envisioned a nation where the citizens were the ultimate guarantors of their own freedom.
It's amazing to think about that. And they had firsthand experience with the effectiveness of these citizen militias. I mean, think about the American Revolution. Those
Yeah.
British officers initially scoffed at the ragtag American militia.
Yeah.
They were in for a rude awakening.
Yeah.
At battles like Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill.
It's a classic David versus Goliath story.
There it is.
And it reminds us that the power of an armed citizenry doesn't just lie in their weapons. It lies in their commitment
Yeah.
to a cause, their willingness to defend their homes
Wow.
and their liberty.
Okay, so the historical backdrop is fascinating. But what about the actual writing of the Second Amendment?
Yeah.
What was going on in their minds as they, debated
Yeah.
and crafted those words?
The debates during the drafting of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were very intense.
Yeah.
But one thing is crystal clear. The founders strongly believed in the importance of an armed citizenry as a counterbalance to federal power.
Right.
They had just fought a war to escape what they saw as tyranny, and they wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. They were really influenced by legal scholars like William Blackstone, who argued that the right to self-defense was fundamental, a law of nature.
And they weren't afraid to speak their minds, Patrick Henry famously said. Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. The great object is that every man be armed. Every man who is able might have a gun.
It's a powerful statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
It encapsulates the conviction behind the Second Amendment. It wasn't some abstract ideal to the founders. It was a practical necessity for a free people.
Wow.
They understood that power ultimately resides, where force resides. And they wanted to make sure that force remained, at least in part, in the hands of the people.
So we've talked about the historical context, the founders' intentions, and this surge in modern gun ownership. But this is a global story, right? Are there any other countries that have embraced this model of an armed citizenry?
The video hosts point to Switzerland as a modern-day example of this model, their system of mandatory military service and widespread gun ownership, they argue, has been a key factor in their neutrality and security. Switzerland has managed to avoid conflict for centuries, despite being surrounded by powerful countries. What do you think? Could that model work elsewhere? Or is it unique to Switzerland?
That's a great question. I don't know if there are any easy answers. Switzerland's success is probably due to a lot of factors, their geography, their culture, their history. But it's definitely something to think about, especially given what's happening here. With the current surge in gun ownership, the video hosts suggest that this trend isn't just about self-defense against criminals. It reflects this growing sense of personal responsibility and maybe even some distrust in government institutions.
Yeah. It's interesting to consider if people are arming themselves out of a sense of empowerment, a desire for self-reliance, or maybe out of fear, a sense of vulnerability. The world feels uncertain.
They even go as far as to say that guns can be a gateway drug to liberty. Now, what do you think they mean by that? Do you think that's a bit of an overstatement?
It's a provocative statement for sure, but I think they're trying to say something deeper. Maybe owning a gun can push people to think more critically about individual rights and responsibilities, about the balance between freedom and security. It can be a powerful symbol of self-reliance, of taking ownership of your own safety and destiny.
And then they even compare guns to a business card for freedom. It's a very striking analogy. What stands out to you about that?
It's memorable. I think it speaks to the power that guns hold for people. It's a way of saying, I'm responsible for my own safety, my own destiny. And that resonates with a lot of people, especially during times of uncertainty or when they feel threatened.
So we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive, from ancient English archery laws to modern-day Switzerland, from the Founding Fathers' vision to the current surge in gun ownership. We have explored the history, the politics, and the philosophy of the Second Amendment. But we're not done yet. There's still so much more to unpack. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll go even deeper into this fascinating and complex topic.
Can't wait. It's interesting to think about how the Founding Fathers would view this resurgence in gun ownership, given their concerns about an armed citizenry, as a check on the government. What do you think they'd say?
It's tough to say. I mean, on one hand, they were adamant about the importance of an armed citizenry. They saw it as essential for a free society. So on that level, they'd probably be pretty happy to see so many Americans embracing their Second Amendment rights. But then again, they were also really concerned about tyranny, about the abuse of power. So I wonder if they might also be a little apprehensive about the motivations behind it all, Like, is it driven by the sense of civic responsibility? Or is there, like, an element of fear and distrust of the government?
It's complex, isn't it? The video hosts touched on this. They even pointed to movements like defund the police as evidence that people are feeling vulnerable and responsible for their own safety, and that this vulnerability is driving a lot of those gun sales. But it's almost a paradox, isn't it? Because a lot of the people advocating for less police are also the ones pushing for stricter gun control.
Yeah, that does seem a bit contradictory. But, let's go back to the history for a minute. The video spent a good chunk of time talking about those old English laws mandating gun ownership. That assize of arms of 1181 really stuck with me. What was so important about that one?
The assize of arms is a great example of how ingrained this idea of an armed citizenry was.
Mhm.
In England, centuries before America, this law basically required every free man to have weapons appropriate to his social standing. So knights needed armor, helmets, shields, lances,
Wow.
while commoners needed simpler weapons like bows and arrows. It wasn't about self-defense, it was a civic duty,
Wow.
a responsibility for the security of the whole country.
So almost like a tiered system of defense.
Hmm.
Everyone playing their part.
Exactly. And that was reinforced by later laws, like the Statute of Winchester in 1285.
You know, it's funny. The Statute of Winchester, named after a rifle that didn't even exist back then. Almost like foreshadowing or something.
Haha. Yeah, it's a funny little detail, but it shows the long history of laws around weapons and then those English archery laws from 1363, requiring practice on Sundays and holidays. Can you imagine?
No way. Instead of relaxing, you're out there practicing with your bow and arrow.
Yeah, it shows how important that citizen militia was to their culture.
That's a far cry from our weekends today, for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of different cultures, the video brought up Switzerland as this like more modern example of the armed citizenry model. What do you think we can learn from the Swiss?
Well, they're definitely a fascinating case study. For centuries, they've had this system of mandatory military service and widespread gun ownership. And many people say it's a key factor in their neutrality and their security.
Yep.
They've avoided being pulled into major conflicts, even though they're surrounded by powerful countries.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, could that work somewhere else? Or is Switzerland just unique?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, it's probably a lot of things. Their geography, their culture, their politics. It's tough to say if it could be replicated. But it does raise some interesting questions about, armed citizens and national security.
It really does.
And it brings us back to that core question. Who should hold the power? The government or the people?
Yeah.
The video hosts are pretty bold. They say the founders believe that monopoly of violence should rest with the people, not the government.
And they back that up with some powerful quotes. Patrick Henry said, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. The great object is that every man be armed. Every man who is able might have a gun." There's no ambiguity there.
No, for sure not.
The founder saw an armed citizenry as absolutely vital to keeping liberty safe.
And they tie that back to William Blackstone, who was a really important legal scholar at the time. Blackstone argued that the right to self-defense was basically a law of nature. But what's interesting is he didn't just mean self-defense against individuals.
Exactly. He argued it extended to tyrannical governments as well.
Wow.
Which of course resonated with the founders. They had just fought a war to free themselves from what they saw as a tyrannical government. They wanted to make sure it didn't happen again.
Right. And the video hosts make this point about a slippery slope. They say that if you start limiting self-defense against individuals, it could eventually lead to limits on defending yourself against the government.
It's a good point. If we chip away at the right to defend ourselves against criminals, are we chipping away at the right to defend ourselves against tyranny?
That's a good question.
It's definitely something to think about.
They also pointed out that a lot of European countries are already way down that slope with strict gun control and limited self-defense rights. They even brought up the Kyle Rittenhouse case as an example of how the legal system can discourage self-defense, especially when things get political.
Yeah, the Rittenhouse case is a tough one. I think it's important to avoid generalizations, but it does make you think about self-defense, especially in high-pressure situations where politics are involved.
For sure, that case was a lightning rod, and it shows how the Second Amendment conversation gets tied up with all these bigger cultural and political issues. It's rarely just about guns. It's about freedom, responsibility, our roles as citizens.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the bigger conversation, the video hosts ended with a pretty powerful message. They said we should see guns as more than just weapons. They called them a gateway drug to liberty.
A gateway drug to liberty.
I know it sounds a bit over the top to some, but I think I get what they're saying.
Yeah, it's definitely a strong statement, but I think they're arguing that owning a gun can lead to this deeper understanding of self-reliance, of your rights, and the responsibilities that come with freedom.
And the fact that those two things are connected.
Exactly.
They even called guns a business card for freedom. Such a striking analogy.
It is. What do you think about that?
I think it speaks to how powerful guns are. It's symbols. It's like saying I'm taking responsibility for my own safety, my own destiny. And that resonates with a lot of people, especially when things feel uncertain.
Absolutely. It's a powerful message. They even brought up the biblical story of the Philistines disarming the Israelites It's a story about the dangers of being defenseless. The Philistines took away their weapons, and then they could control them. It's a cautionary tale, you know.
It is. Yeah, freedom's a fragile thing. It's something you have to constantly defend.
Exactly.
And the video hosts definitely believe that armed citizens are a big part of that defense.
They do, but they also acknowledge the potential dangers of gun ownership.
Yeah, they're not saying everyone should run out and get a gun.
Right, they believe in accountability, in
Yeah.
consequences for people who misuse them.
It's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between individual liberty and the safety of everyone.
Yeah, finding that balance is tricky. There's no easy answer.
No, not at all.
They ended the video with this great question. If the Founding Fathers cared so much about an armed citizenry as a check on the government, what does this surge in gun ownership tell us about how much we trust our institutions today?
That's a good question to end on. Is it a healthy skepticism of government? Or is it something deeper? Societal anxiety, division. Maybe it's both. One thing's for sure, this isn't going away anytime soon.
You're absolutely right.
We've covered a lot in this second part, from the roots of the Second Amendment to the founders' vision, to the Swiss model, and this whole idea of self-defense, and that balance between individual liberty and keeping everyone safe. But there's still more to uncover. Join us for part 3, where we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating and multifaceted topic. This deep dive has taken us everywhere, from ancient Europe to modern America. It's amazing how this one touches on so many big questions.
It really does.
Power, freedom, responsibility.
It all boils down to, like you said, that age-old question, who gets to use force? The government or the people?
Right.
And that's just as important now as it was back then.
I thought it was interesting how much the hosts stressed the history of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
They said people get caught up in the politics of it all without understanding where it came from, all that tradition and experience.
Yeah, I think they're right.
Like, who knew that English common law had so much to say about guns?
Right.
Those archery laws from, what was it, 1363?
Yeah.
You had to practice on your days off. Can you imagine?
No way.
That really shows how different things were.
Yeah.
Back then, it wasn't just a right. It was like a duty.
Yeah, it was a responsibility to be ready.
Yeah.
To defend your community.
Right, your way of life.
Exactly. And I think the hosts are saying that maybe we've lost some of that responsibility today. That maybe this surge in gun ownership means people are losing faith in those big institutions.
Right.
And they feel like they need to take care of themselves.
And they even said that guns can be a gateway drug to liberty, which sounds extreme, but I kind of get it.
It's a strong statement, but I see what they mean. Maybe owning a gun, it forces you to grow in a way.
Yeah.
You have to confront those big questions about freedom and responsibility, the use of force.
Right. It's not something you take lightly, owning a gun.
No, not at all. And that's why they care so much about safety and education.
Right, right.
People need to understand what it all means.
Not just how to use a gun,
Yeah.
but like you said, the ethics of it all,
Exactly.
the philosophy.
They also had that analogy about the business card for freedom.
Right, right.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's powerful, you know, this idea of a gun as a symbol. Like you're saying, I'm taking care of myself, my security.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a message that really hits home for a lot of people.
It does, especially when they feel uncertain or
Wow.
threatened.
Right. But it's not just about the individual. Right. It's also about, like we were saying before, that responsibility to our communities,
Yeah.
to our way of life. And that brings us back to the founders, their vision of citizens with guns as a check on the government's power. And the host made it clear, this wasn't just some American thing. This idea goes way back to English common law and political thought.
They did. They mentioned Blackstone again. Remember how he said self-defense isn't just against people.
Right.
He said it applies to governments too. Tyrannical governments.
The founders really took that to heart.
Yeah.
They had just fought a revolution
To free themselves.
and they didn't want to go through that again.
Exactly.
They saw an armed citizenry as this vital protection
Yeah.
against tyranny.
It's about making sure the government answers to the people.
Right, right. But it's such a tough balance, isn't it? Individual liberty versus keeping everyone safe.
It is.
How do we do both?
It's a question that's been around forever.
And there's no easy answer.
It's so complex.
So what are the big takeaways then from this whole deep dive?
Well, one thing's for sure. This right to bear arms is a deeply rooted idea. It's not something new. It's been debated for centuries.
Right, and it comes with responsibility.
Exactly.
Owning a gun means being accountable,
Right.
understanding the power you have.
And the hosts reminded us the Second Amendment isn't just about protecting yourself from criminals.
Right.
It's about protecting liberty itself.
Making sure the government doesn't overreach.
Exactly. It's a reminder that freedom isn't free.
Right.
You have to be vigilant, ready to defend it.
And maybe that's what we're seeing now. With more people buying guns, maybe it's a wake-up call.
It's an interesting thought.
It makes you think.
It does. As we wrap this up, I'm feeling hopeful and concerned. Hopeful because more people are thinking about these big questions, about liberty and responsibility.
Right.
But also concerned about all the division, the anxiety that's driving this whole debate.
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
That's not going away anytime soon.
You're right about that.
But hopefully, this deep dive gave everyone some new things to think about.
I hope so too.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Until next time, keep diving deep.